it comes into existence as part and parcel of the struggle for democracy. And the problem is, of course, that the capacity to bring about this transformation is generally weakest amongst those who have the greatest stake in such transformation. These are poor people, vulnerable, socially excluded. They lack the basic means of production, they live close to survival, they rely on others for security of livelihoods. And it is not possible for them to raise their voice because it might jeopardize the small securities that we do have. And in such societies, these inequalities are often reproduced and legitimized by hegemonic ideologies which justify their subordinate status and help to secure compliance on their part to their place in the social order. And as we know, the most successful forms of hegemony are those that do not merely deny subordinate groups the right to exercise voice and agency, but also close off their capacity to imagine an alternative way of life, to close off their capacity of what Arjuna Purdarai calls the capacity to aspire. To become a citizen in these contexts, therefore, is to transcend the constraints of ascribed status and to acquire this capacity to aspire, to question, to challenge what is given, and to act in pursuit of an alternative vision. While this kind of transformation must always begin at the level of the individual, at the level of recognizing the injustice of one's own situation, it is through interactions with others who share their oppressed status that the transformation of individual consciousness takes on a political quality. As history has shown, it is not the protests of isolated individuals, but the collective struggles of the dispossessed that win the rights of citizenship. This emphasis on the collective dimensions of personal transformation resonates with the ontological perspective I outlined earlier. It accepts that one's sense of identity and self does not exist prior to or outside of one's social relationships, but is constituted intersubjectively. To quote Sailor Ben Habib, quoting Habermas, it is the kinds of associations that we inhabit that define the kinds of individuals that we will become. It is through our associations with others that we learn to speak, think, act, to understand ourselves and our place in the world. This way of linking identity, association, and practice, I think, offered me some important insights into the theory of social change, which informed my research. First of all, it suggests that one's sense of self and identity is not predetermined and fixed by the community of fate into which we are born, but it can be transformed through participation in other forms of association in life, particularly those that provide us a critical distance from that which has till now appeared to be preordained or given. And it therefore opens up that possibility of questioning and criticizing the justice of the social order into which we have been born. At the same time, I think this idea of identity and association allows for the fact that not all forms of association will necessarily promote the same kinds of transformative change. Indeed, many associations set out to reinforce existing inequalities or to promote new ones. Associations are most likely to promote personal transformation and democratic practice when they are chosen rather than given, when they are inclusive and open rather than exclusionary in their membership, when they draw on horizontal rather than hierarchical loyalties, and when they embody democratic rather than autocratic principles, and when they seek to challenge the arbitrary exercise of power rather than bolstering the status quo. So it is really this literature, I think, on associations, identity, transformation, change, that led me in the first project that I got involved with in the citizenship program to do something very simple, and that was to ask what kinds of associations outside of the given ones of family and kinship do the working poor in Bangladesh have access to? And to what extent do these chosen associations transform their sense of who they are? I chose to focus on the working poor because of my assumption that struggle to earn a living occupies a central place in the daily experiences of poor people. It is therefore in the context of their livelihood struggles that they are most likely to come into contact with associations outside family and kinship, and this is particularly likely to be true for women. Bangladesh offers a very interesting context in which to study these issues. First of all, it exemplifies many of the barriers to citizenship that I've outlined earlier. It has been under military rule for much of its existence, but it is not the absence or presence of democratic rule that determines the barriers to citizenship. The state in Bangladesh has never been equally accessible to all, regardless of who is in power. Resources are allocated instead through pervasive patron-client relationships, which stretch from the village level to the national level, and which dominate all networks locally and nationally. Bangladesh was described as one of the world's most corrupt countries the most corrupt country in the world for 5 years running by Transparency International. Jeff Wood, who has done work in Bangladesh for many years, used the metaphor of the prison to convey the idea of Bangladesh as a total institution which prescribes all aspects of its inmates' lives, locating them within hierarchical structures that are so deep-rooted that, I quote, that is so deep-rooted in the psychology of Bangladeshi society that they translate into a natural deference-authority dyad. This makes it impossible for the inmates to either reform their institutions or to free themselves through their own efforts. You can see a very pessimistic view then of the possibilities for Bangladesh to change. Another academic, Rahman Zuban, offers a somewhat less pessimistic analysis. He notes that though inequalities in Bangladesh have deepened over time, they are not as closely bound up with the entrenched inequalities based on ascribed identity that characterizes the semi-feudal and caste-based social structures of India, Pakistan, and Nepal. He says that it is more fluid in Bangladesh, with considerable scope for upward mobility. Bangladesh's prevailing social hierarchies remain exposed to challenge from below, as well as competing aspirants, because the legitimacy of these differences are not so widely accepted. This idea of the possibility of a challenge from below is, I think, a second reason why Bangladesh is an interesting place to study these questions. You may or may not know that it is considered to have one of the most vibrant civil societies in the developing world anyway. It was estimated that there were around 22,000 registered associations in Bangladesh, and this does not, of course, count all the unregistered ones. They include trade unions, labor organizations, welfare associations, religious groups, cultural organizations, legal advocacy groups, etc., and of course development NGOs. However, these organizations are distributed somewhat unevenly across the population. As far as the working poor are concerned, there are a very limited number of these organizations that are likely to be relevant. Trade unions, obviously, for people who are working in formal factories of various kinds, but they are non-existent among informal workers. The main organization among informal workers in both the countryside and in rural urban areas are various forms of informal saving associations, as well as development NGOs, many of them microfinance based, but also social mobilization based. So as this first research project, we decided to set up to interview sections of the working poor that had come into contact with these kinds of associations. And this included the nationalized jute industry had just been denationalized, there had been widespread retrenchment, male-dominated industry, so we interviewed some of the men from that industry. We interviewed both men and women from the garment industry, which is export-oriented, and we interviewed a number of informal workers in the urban economy who were linked with microfinance associations of various kinds. And in the countryside, we chose 3 organizations, one focused on microfinance, but with a social agenda, which is BRAC, the largest NGO in the world, and 2 others, Shomaka and Hijrakuri, which are both social mobilization organizations. The interviews confirmed the pervasiveness of bad governance in Bangladesh, and the central role of the state in generating and perpetuating the state of affairs. But it also suggested that the state was not a uniformly negative presence across the lives of people, including the lives of the poor. It varied across failing and competitive industries, across urban and rural, across public and private, and so on. But it was variations across the urban-rural divide that emerged as the most striking finding in our research. Now, the state was experienced as a malign presence by most urban respondents. This could be attributed to various actions that the state had taken in recent times. One, of course, was the retrenchment of the jute mills, where workers who had worked for many 15, 20, 30 years were overnight without jobs and with very little redundancy payments. But the state had also been involved in major evictions of slum neighborhoods in order to make way for new property development. And around the time of the research, it had just banned rickshaws from the main streets of the capital. And rickshaws, as you might know, is a very important form of livelihood for the informal economy. In addition to this, there was the absence of the state, which was also a problem. The state very deliberately does not provide public utilities in slums, to some extent because it wishes to discourage migration to the countryside. So the slum areas of the capital are, subject to extremely poor sanitation, overcrowding, crime, and so on. Now, it was very clear from the interviews with these different sets of workers that none of them saw their associations as having much value for them. I have some quotes here from the different sections, the other middle workers. As you can see, they blame the rich, they blame the government for not mediating in the way that the whole closing down of factories took place, and they blame the trade unions. And the stories they tell you are about collusion between trade union leaders, management, and political leaders, and widespread corruption and rent seeking by trade union leaders over many, many years. Garment workers, both male and female, have very sporadic relationships with their trade unions. Trade unions are not allowed to mobilize in the factories, and some of them have no notion of it. This first interview comes from a rickshaw, a man who used to drive a rickshaw, now works in a factory, and all he can remember is the lack of respect that he has encountered in all of his interactions with the state. And the woman, who is the next speaker, has a very interesting quote, because she says that in a way she sort of feeds into Jeff Wood's idea of the prison. That after having worked so long in the industry, she realizes that those who do wrong and those who allow it to happen are completely liable. But the workers have accepted this unfair system. There is very little that they can do to change it. These are some of the microfinance borrowers. Many of them are informal workers. And as you can see from the first quote, this is a woman who doesn't have much ideas of this notion of rights. When we asked her, do you know what a right means? Oh, well, she said, I don't know what rights are, I don't know what I can claim, but if the government could give us a bit of business and some gas for my cooking, well, that would help a lot. Others talk about how the rich have complete contempt for them, treat them as shoes that can be thrown away. And a third one, a government that is completely corrupt. Why should the police not take bribes? Political parties are the ones that generate terrorist groups. In Bangladesh, the word terrorist doesn't mean quite what it does in the US. It just means, criminals of various kinds.